Thera had always known that she was different from other elves. While her people celebrated their 1,000-year reign over the Sky Kingdoms, she wondered what lay beyond the clouds. Her pointed ears would twitch with curiosity whenever the ancient archives mentioned worlds beyond their own. But curiosity was not valued in the high councils. Power was what mattered. Dominion was what counted. The elf woman spent her mornings in the crystal tower that overlooked the entire eastern province. Her chambers held maps of every corner of their world, charts showing wind patterns and migration routes of lesser creatures, and ancient texts written in languages that even few elves could read anymore. She was considered brilliant by her people, yet also strange. At 237 years old, she held more authority than any elf had for centuries, yet she used that authority in ways that puzzled everyone. Thera stood at her window watching the sky turn from deep purple to pale blue as the morning approached. Her silver hair hung past her shoulders in intricate braids woven with threads of white gold. Her gray eyes seemed to see things that other elves could not. She wore robes of midnight blue silk embroidered with patterns that told stories of ancient wars and forgotten alliances. Beside her in the tower sat her 2 dragons. Midnight was the elder of the pair, with scales so black they seemed to absorb light itself. He was nearly 300 years old and had been with Thera since her youth. His massive body took up almost half of the chamber, his tail coiled around marble pillars that had been built specifically to support his weight. Storm was younger, barely 200 years old, with scales that shimmered between silver and deep gray depending on how the light touched them. Both creatures were intelligent in ways that went beyond mere animal instinct. They understood language, emotion, and the complex politics that governed the elf world. Thera reached out and touched Midnight's snout. The dragon made a low rumbling sound that vibrated through her entire body. She had learned to understand these sounds over the long years of their companionship. This rumble meant something was coming. Something that would change everything. The messenger arrived before the sun cleared the horizon. A young elf named Lyrian burst into the chamber without bothering to announce himself. His face was flushed with excitement and his hands shook slightly as he bowed before Thera. He was barely 100 years old, still practically a child by elf standards, yet he held the position of council announcer. It was an important role, which meant he carried important news. "The colony ship has arrived," Lyrian said breathlessly. "The humans are here. They landed in the lower valley at midnight. The council is convening an emergency meeting. They are asking for your attendance immediately." Thera did not seem surprised by this news. She had known it was coming. The Sky Watchers had reported the ship's approach 3 weeks ago. She had spent those weeks preparing herself for what would come next. The humans were exactly what the Sky Kingdoms needed, though most of her people would not see it that way. She dressed slowly, choosing her formal council robes. These were white silk trimmed with gold that caught and reflected light as she moved. Around her waist she fastened a belt made from a single piece of star metal, a material so rare that only the oldest elf families possessed it. On her head she placed a circlet that marked her rank and authority. These were not ornaments for show. Each piece told a story. Each item had been earned through centuries of service and wisdom. Midnight and Storm followed her as she descended from the tower. The dragons could not enter the council chambers, but they would wait in the great gardens below. The gardens had been shaped and cultivated for thousands of years, and they were one of the few places in the Sky Cities large enough to accommodate creatures of such size. The council chamber was already filled when Thera arrived. 12 of the most powerful elf lords sat in a circle, their faces grave and their eyes fixed on a large viewing screen that showed the human colony from high above. The settlement was small and primitive by elf standards. They had built simple shelters from wood and metal. Lights flickered around the perimeter, showing where they had set up defensive positions. The humans were careful and organized, which was interesting. They had expected to find predators or chaos. Instead, they found evidence of planning and structure. Kestra stood as Thera entered. She was a warrior of some renown, known for her fierce protection of elf traditions and her deep suspicion of anything that threatened their way of life. She was also 300 years younger than Thera, yet she had been campaigning for a greater voice in the council for the last decade. "The humans are an invasion force," Kestra declared loudly. "They have landed weapons and military equipment. They have set up defensive positions. They are clearly preparing to expand and conquer. We must strike them down before they become a problem." Several of the council members nodded in agreement. Fear was a powerful force even among creatures as long-lived as elves. The unknown was frightening. A species they had never encountered before was terrifying. Thera walked slowly to the center of the circle and sat down. She did not speak immediately. Instead, she studied the viewing screen, watching the humans move about their colony. She saw mothers carrying children. She saw workers constructing shelters. She saw leaders pointing and directing the placement of equipment. These did not look like the actions of an invasion force. They looked like the actions of refugees. What we see here is survival, not conquest, Thera said calmly. These humans came from a dying world. Their ship shows signs of long travel and damage that comes from traveling through space. They are not seeking to take our lands. They are seeking sanctuary. Kestra laughed sharply. How can you possibly know what they want, she challenged. You have never even seen one of these creatures up close. You are letting sentiment and weakness cloud your judgment. Thera's gray eyes hardened slightly. I know because I have studied every report from our Skywatchers. I have analyzed their movements and their patterns. I have reviewed their communications as best we can understand them. Everything they do indicates that they seek to establish a home, not to wage war. But what about our security? Demanded Hector, another council member. What if you are wrong? What if they eventually decide to expand into our territories? What if they breed rapidly and overwhelm us with their numbers? Thera understood these fears. Elves lived for centuries and they thought in terms of centuries. The idea of rapid population growth among short-lived species was genuinely threatening to their way of thinking. But she also understood something that many of her people had forgotten. Strength did not come from walls and weapons alone. Strength came from understanding, from adaptability, from the wisdom to see potential allies instead of automatic enemies. We could establish a boundary, she suggested. We could create a zone of mutual respect where humans settle in the lower valleys, and we maintain our control of the sky cities. We could observe them. We could learn from them, and perhaps in time we could build an alliance that benefits both our peoples. The chamber erupted in argument. Some elves agreed with Thera's vision. Others sided with Kestra's call for immediate military action. The debate raged for hours, circling endlessly around the same arguments. Finally, Arian, the eldest council member, called for a vote. When the count was finished, Thera had lost. 9 councils voted in favor of military action. Only 3 supported her position. The decision was made. At dawn, 3 days hence, the elf forces would attack the human colony and destroy it completely. Kestra's face glowed with triumph. She began immediately to make plans for the assault. She called for warrior volunteers. She organized troops. She ensured that every elf family understood that the humans would be eliminated, and the danger would be ended. Thera said nothing. She simply stood and walked from the chamber while the others were still celebrating. By the time she returned to the Crystal Tower, her mind was made up. She could not prevent the attack through politics or debate, but perhaps there was another way. Perhaps she could warn the humans. Perhaps she could give them a chance to defend themselves or escape. It was betrayal, pure and simple. The elf councils would call it treason. They would strip her of her titles and cast her out. But Thera had accepted long ago that sometimes doing what was right meant accepting terrible consequences. She stood once more at her window, looking out at the endless sky. Midnight and Storm emerged from the gardens below, sensing her decision through the bond they shared. They knew what she intended to do. They had known perhaps before she did. Dragons were creatures of instinct and wisdom combined. They understood loyalty and they understood moral courage. Thera climbed onto Midnight's back and felt Storm position himself beside them. The dragons spread their massive wings, catching the wind that flowed through the sky cities. They pushed off from the tower and began to move downward, away from the elf settlements, toward the hidden valleys where the humans waited. There was no turning back now. By morning, she would either save an entire species or destroy herself trying. The fate of 2 worlds now rested on whether a human captain would listen to an elf woman who came in the dark to warn of war. Midnight's wings beat powerfully against the night air. Storm flew in perfect formation beside him, and Thera held tight, her heart pounding. The human colony sprawled across the valley floor like a carefully arranged game board. Captain Rodriguez stood in the command center, studying the holographic displays that showed their current situation. The colony had been on this world for Exactly 3 days, and already he could feel the weight of leadership pressing down on him. 3,000 lives depended on his decisions. 3,000 people who had left their dying world behind, trusting that he would keep them safe. Rodriguez was a man in his 50s with gray threading through his dark hair and lines on his face that told stories of countless previous missions. He had survived 17 encounters with hostile species on 17 different worlds. He had learned lessons that most humans never got the chance to learn. The most important lesson was simple. Always listen before you fight. Always try to understand before you attack. Around him, his command staff monitored various systems. Dr. Elena Martinez ran the science division, and she was currently analyzing the atmospheric composition and studying the planet's ecology. She was brilliant and cautious, always wanting more data before making decisions. Commander Hayes managed the military operations, and he was in constant communication with the patrol teams scattered around the colony's perimeter. Hayes was younger and more aggressive, favoring direct action over diplomatic solutions. "Sir, we are detecting large energy signatures in the upper atmosphere," Hayes said, pointing at one of the displays. "They are organizing in patterns that our tactical computer suggests indicate military formation." Rodriguez felt his stomach tighten. This was what they had feared. The planet had clearly hosted intelligent life, and apparently that intelligent life had noticed them. The big question was whether they were friendly or hostile. "How long until they reach us?" he asked calmly. "At their current velocity, approximately 2 hours," Hayes answered. Rodriguez made a decision quickly. "Begin defensive preparations, but keep them minimal. Do not activate weapon systems yet. Do not show obvious hostility. If they wanted us destroyed, they could have done it already. The fact that they are taking time to gather suggests they are uncertain about us. We should match their uncertainty with caution." Elena looked up from her analysis station. "Sir, I have been studying the energy signatures from their ships. They are using technology far more advanced than ours. Dramatically more advanced. They are decades ahead of us at minimum. Probably more. Then war is not our best option," Rodriguez said firmly. "Hayes, assign our best negotiators to stand by. Prepare translation software for first contact protocols. And someone get me everything we have on peaceful first contact procedures." The 2 hours felt like forever. Soldiers took positions at the perimeter. Medical teams prepared for injuries. Children were moved into the underground shelters that had been constructed during the colony's first days on the planet. Everyone waited, tension filling the air like an actual physical force. Then the dragons appeared. They came down through the clouds without any warning, 2 massive creatures with scales that caught the starlight and threw it back in shimmering waves. For a moment, chaos erupted. Soldiers shouted. Weapons were drawn. Alarms screamed throughout the colony, but Rodriguez was already moving toward the landing site. "Hold your fire," he commanded over the communication network. "Hold your positions, but do not fire unless I give the direct order." The dragons touched, down in the open space that had been left between the colony buildings specifically for emergencies. They settled to the ground with surprising grace for creatures so enormous, their wings folded against their bodies. Their heads turned, studying the human settlement with obvious intelligence. Then a figure dismounted from the larger dragon. She was the most beautiful and most alien creature Rodriguez had ever seen. Tall and slender with skin that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Her ears came to sharp points, and her eyes were the color of storm clouds. She wore robes that shimmered with colors that seemed to shift between blue and purple. She walked slowly toward the colony, her hands held empty and open. "Do not fire," Rodriguez repeated into his communicator. "I am going out to meet them." "Sir, that is extremely dangerous," Hayes protested. "Everything about this situation is dangerous," Rodriguez replied. "But I have learned that the only way to turn dangerous into manageable is through communication. Establish a secure channel so I can record this interaction and get me our best linguist to analyze her language." Rodriguez walked out into the open ground between the colony and the dragons. He moved slowly and deliberately, keeping his weapon holstered but visible. He wanted the alien creature to understand that he was armed, but not immediately hostile. The elf woman stopped a few meters away from him. When she spoke, Her voice was like music. The words did not match any language that Rodriguez was familiar with, yet somehow his translator began working on converting the sounds into something approaching English. "I come alone to prevent a war that need not happen," she said. "At dawn, my people will attack your colony. They believe you are a threat. They are wrong." Rodriguez's mind raced through the implications of what she had just said. An attack was coming, but this creature was warning him. That meant she was not part of the attacking force. That meant there were factions even among her people. "Why would you warn us," he asked carefully, "if your own people are coming? What do you gain from this? Because," the elf woman said slowly, "strength is not the ability to destroy. Strength is the wisdom to build. Your people have traveled far, seeking a home. My people have a home that we fear losing. But the sky is vast. There is room for both of us." Rodriguez studied her face, looking for any sign of deception. What he saw instead was determination mixed with sadness. This was someone who had made an enormously difficult choice and was prepared to accept the consequences. "I believe you," he said finally. He reached down slowly and took off the translation device he was wearing. He held it out toward her. "This might help us communicate more clearly. What is your name?" The elf woman took the device carefully. "I am Thera, and you are the leader of your people, I assume. I am Captain Rodriguez. Come inside. We need to talk about what is coming." Thera glanced back at her dragons. They had remained perfectly still, watching, but not moving. She nodded to them as if having a conversation without words. Then she followed Rodriguez into the colony. Inside the command center, chaos briefly erupted as people reacted to seeing an alien for the first time. But Rodriguez's calm authority established order quickly. He had everyone who was not essential leave the command center. That left himself, Elena, Hayes, and 2 communications specialists. Thera stood in the middle of the command center, studying the displays and equipment with obvious intelligence. She said nothing, simply observing everything with those gray eyes that seemed to see far too much. "Tell us everything you know about the coming attack," Elena said. "Troop numbers, weapons capabilities, timing, strategic goals. Everything." Thera spent the next hour providing detailed information. There would be 300 warriors riding on lesser dragons. They would strike from above, using coordinated aerial attacks to disable the colony's central hub first. They would aim to minimize casualties not because they cared about human lives, but because a quick, overwhelming victory would leave fewer witnesses and questions about how successful the assault was. "Kestra leads them," Thera said. "She is a great warrior but not a great strategist. She will follow the battle plans that have been approved by the Council. If you know the plans, you can prepare defenses." Hayes studied the tactical information carefully. "This is unusual," he said. "If they really want to kill us, they could bombard the colony from above. They could use some kind of orbital weapon. Instead, they are choosing to fight in close proximity. Because," Thera explained, "my people believe that direct combat is honorable and orbital weapons are the refuge of cowards. This is one of the things that makes my people both great and limited. They have strength but also blind spots." "What do you need from us?" Rodriguez asked. "Time," Thera said. "I need time to work with your engineers and planners. I can show you how to fortify the colony in ways that will make an aerial assault extremely difficult. I can explain the weaknesses in their tactics, and I can make certain that when the attack comes, you will be ready." Rodriguez made another decision. "Hayes, begin defensive preparations based on the information we have received. Bring in the engineer teams. We are going to fortify this colony in ways that the enemy will not expect. Elena, prepare a full analysis of what Thera has told us. I want to know everything about potential vulnerabilities in her information." For the next hours, Thera worked alongside Rodriguez's team. She showed them where the elf warriors would likely concentrate their attacks. She explained how their lesser dragons fought and what their behaviors would be in combat. She helped identify positions where human weapons could be placed for maximum effectiveness. By the time dawn was approaching, the human colony had been transformed into a defensive fortress. Metal reinforcements had been welded into place. Weapons had been strategically positioned. Escape routes had been prepared. Everything had been arranged according to Thera's guidance and Rodriguez's tactical knowledge. The morning sky turned blood red as the sun climbed toward the horizon. Thera stood at the edge of the colony, watching the clouds gather in the distance. She could feel them coming. Her centuries of experience with elf warfare gave her an almost instinctive sense of when and where the attack would begin. The first strike would come from the north. The secondary assault would come from the west. They would try to create a pincer movement designed to catch the defenders in a crossfire. Beside her, Midnight and Storm stood alert, their muscles tense and ready. The dragons had participated in countless battles over the centuries. They understood the rhythms of war, the patterns of attack and defense. But this would be different. This time they would be fighting against their own kind. This time the battle lines had been drawn not by tradition or council decree, but by an act of conscience. Rodriguez appeared beside Thera, his military uniform crisp and his face composed. He had not slept either. The past hours had been consumed with final preparations, positioning troops, making last decisions about where to place defensive resources. He had lived through enough battles to understand that all the planning in the world might not matter once the fighting actually started. But proper preparation gave you better chances of survival. "The warriors are ready," he said to Thera. "Your information has been invaluable. We know where they will strike first. We have positioned our best soldiers in defensive positions. We have placed our most advanced weapon systems to maximize damage and minimize casualties on our side." Thera said nothing. She simply continued watching the distant clouds where the elf forces were gathering. "Do you have regrets?" Rodriguez asked. "About what you have done? About standing against your own people?" Thera turned to look at him, and for a moment he could see the weight of centuries pressing down on her shoulders. "Regrets are useless," she said softly. "I have made my choice. I have accepted the consequences. Whatever happens today, I will face it knowing that I did what my conscience demanded. That must be enough." The first attack came without warning. A wave of lesser dragons emerged from the northern clouds, their wings spread wide and their bodies moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit that had trained together for generations. Each dragon carried 2 or 3 elf warriors armed with weapons that crackled with energy. The elf riders began attacking immediately, firing bursts of charged particles at the colony's defensive perimeter. But the colony was ready. Automated weapon systems activated in perfect sequence, laying down a devastating pattern of fire that caught the elf forces completely off guard. Several of the lesser dragons were hit immediately. They spiraled downward, their riders struggling to maintain control as the creatures screamed in pain and confusion. The elf warriors had expected to find a simple human settlement with basic defenses. Instead, they found a fully prepared military fortress. Kestra's voice crackled over the elf communication frequencies, ordering the forces to press the attack regardless of the casualties. Her pride was wounded by this unexpected resistance. She had expected to crush the humans easily, to prove to the council that her aggressive approach was correct. Now she faced the possibility of failure, and she would not accept it. The western assault came next, waves of elf warriors descending from that direction, with the clear intention of overrunning the colony's secondary defensive positions. But again, Rodriguez's forces were ready. The human soldiers had positioned themselves exactly where Thera had suggested, in locations that provided maximum defensive advantage while minimizing exposure to aerial attacks. Thera moved into the command center and began communicating with the human commanders, translating Kestra's orders and providing real-time analysis of the changing battle conditions. She explained what the next attack would be before it happened. She warned them when the elf forces would shift tactics. She provided guidance that turned each potential human weakness into a prepared strength. An hour into the battle, the tide had clearly turned. The elf forces were suffering heavy casualties. Several of their lesser dragons had been destroyed completely. Many of their warriors had been killed or injured. Kestra's coordinated assault was crumbling into chaos as the elf commander realized that her assumed victory had turned into a genuine military disaster. Then Kestra herself appeared in the sky. Above the colony, she rode a dragon, larger and more powerful than the lesser dragons that made up the bulk of her forces. This was a war dragon, a creature that had been bred and trained specifically for military combat. Kestra herself was a magnificent fighter, a woman who had devoted her entire existence to the art of warfare. She was perhaps not as intelligent as Thera, but she was more directly lethal. Kestra saw Thera standing in the colony, and rage filled her entire being. She screamed across the communication network, her voice filled with hatred and fury. "Traitor!" she shrieked. "You have betrayed everything our people stand for. You have sided with aliens against your own kind. Your punishment will be absolute." Kestra guided her war dragon down toward the colony, accelerating directly toward Thera's position. Her intention was clear. She was going to kill Thera herself, to make an example of the traitor, to prove that disloyalty to the elf people resulted in immediate and total destruction. But Midnight and Storm were faster. Both dragons launched themselves into the air, moving with the coordination that came from centuries of fighting together. They intercepted Kestra's war dragon before it could reach the colony. What happened next was a display of pure dragon combat, something that most humans had never witnessed and never would again. Midnight attacked from above, raking his claws across the war dragon's back. Storm came from the side, his teeth finding purchase on the larger creature's wing. The war dragon roared and fought back fiercely, but Kestra had taught her mount to fight other lesser dragons. She had not taught it to fight two ancient dragons that had been designed and bred specifically to be warriors of incomparable skill. The battle was brutal and beautiful at the same time. 3 dragons locked in combat high above the colony, their movements traced by the weapons fire that continued below, their struggle outlined against the red morning sky. Kestra fought with absolute commitment, using every weapon and technique she possessed. But she was fighting against centuries of experience and a bond between Midnight, Storm, and Thera that no single fighter could overcome. Finally, with a movement that was almost too fast to follow, Storm managed to pin Kestra's war dragon's wing. Midnight circled and struck from above, his massive talons hitting the war dragon squarely in the chest. The larger dragon screamed and fell from the sky. Kestra managed to throw herself free of her mount before the creature crashed to the ground. She landed hard on the valley floor, rolling away from the impact. Blood streamed from a gash on her forehead. Her armor was dented and damaged, but she was alive. She stood slowly, and when she looked at Thera, the fire had gone out of her eyes. She understood now that she had lost. She understood that her approach had been fundamentally flawed. But more than that, she understood that Thera had won. The ancient elf had won through a display of power and will that Kestra could not overcome. Thera walked toward Kestra slowly, with Midnight and Storm flanking her on either side. The 2 dragons were breathing heavily from their exertions, but their eyes were fixed on the fallen elf warrior. "You can kill me if you wish," Kestra said, her voice hollow and defeated. "I have been defeated. I no longer have the right to live." Thera stopped before her and studied Kestra for a long moment. Then she did something that shocked everyone watching. She extended her hand to Kestra. "You have courage," Thera said. "Courage is not measured by whether you are right or wrong. It is measured by how fully you commit to what you believe. What you were wrong about was not your courage. You were wrong about your conviction that we had no choice but to destroy. You were wrong about believing that difference must mean conflict." Kestra stared at Thera's extended hand. She looked at Midnight and Storm. She looked at the human soldiers who had stopped fighting and were now simply watching this exchange. She looked back at the elf forces who were beginning to retreat into the clouds, their assault completely broken. "What happens now?" Kestra asked. "Now," Thera said, "we go back to the council. We tell them what happened here. We tell them that the humans are not an invasion force. We tell them that 2 species can coexist, and we tell them that the strongest choice is not always the destructive one." Rodriguez stepped forward and stood beside Thera. He extended his hand toward Kestra in the human gesture of peace. "You fought well," he said simply. "I have seen many warriors in my life. You are one of the finest. Perhaps you could help us understand how to build peace instead of war. We might have need of someone who understands both battle and the difference between victory and wisdom." Kestra looked at the extended hands of both Thera and Rodriguez. She thought of the humans she had tried to destroy just hours ago. She thought of the elf warriors who had died following her orders. She thought of a different path, one that her people had abandoned centuries ago. Slowly, she reached out and placed her hands in theirs. The return to the Sky Cities was silent and weighted with tension. Thera flew on Midnight's back with Kestra riding on Storm beside her. Behind them, Rodriguez had chosen to ride as well, his first journey on the back of a dragon. He gripped Storm's scales tightly, trying to ignore the way the ground fell away beneath him, and the wind threatened to rip him from his perch. They approached the crystal towers just as the sun reached its highest point in the sky. The elf sentries watching from the wall saw them coming and sounded alarms immediately. A woman riding on an ancient war dragon was not unusual. But a woman riding on 2 dragons, one carrying an alien creature, was unprecedented. By the time they landed in the great courtyard before the council chambers, hundreds of elves had gathered to witness this impossible arrival. Thera dismounted slowly, aware that every eye was fixed on her. She had been gone for less than 24 hours, but in that time she had become a different person. The uncertainty that had marked her before was gone. She had made her choice and committed to it completely. That clarity showed in every movement she made. Rodriguez dismounted from Storm with considerably less grace than Thera had shown. He stumbled slightly on the alien ground, his legs not quite steady after the flight, but he recovered quickly and stood straight, meeting the stares of the assembled elves with calm authority. Kestra dismounted last, her movements slow and deliberate. She had sent messages ahead during the flight, telling the council that the military campaign had failed and that she was bringing information that would change everything. Still, the sight of an elf warrior walking beside an alien human created confusion and concern among those watching. The council was waiting in the great chamber. All 13 members sat in their seats of star metal, their faces expressions of shock and anger. Arion, the eldest, rose to his feet as Thera entered with Rodriguez beside her. "Thera, daughter of the ancient lines, what is the meaning of this betrayal?" Arion demanded, his voice shaking with fury. "You were ordered to attend the council meeting. Instead, you have disappeared with the ancient dragons. Now you return with an alien creature at your side. Explain yourself before we strip you of all rank and cast you out forever." Thera stepped forward into the center of the council chamber. She did not look at Arion. Instead, she spoke to all of the assembled elves, ensuring that every word was heard and would be remembered. "I have committed treason against the council's orders," she said clearly. "I have betrayed your military campaign. I have worked with the humans to prepare defenses against our assault. And I would do it again because it was the only choice that led toward wisdom instead of destruction." The chamber erupted in angry voices. Kestra held up her hand, and incredibly, the elves fell silent. She had authority that came from centuries of respected service, and even in her defeat, that authority held weight. "It is true," Kestra said. "The humans were prepared for our attack. They knew our tactics and our timing. They knew where we would strike and how we would attack. Because of this knowledge, we suffered terrible casualties. Many brave elf warriors died today. Not because the humans were more powerful, but because we chose to attack an enemy that Thera knew was not our enemy at all." "This is admission of treason," shouted Hector. "You should both be executed immediately. But it is also admission of something else," said Elena. She appeared in the chamber doorway, having been brought to the Sky Cities by elf scouts who found her waiting at the colony's edge. Thera had sent her specifically to speak to the council. "My name is Dr. Elena Martinez. I am the scientific director of the human colony. I have been asked to explain something to you that Thera could not." The council regarded Elena with suspicion and confusion. She was clearly not elf. She was clearly not a threat by herself. Yet allowing her to speak seemed like a violation of 1,000 unwritten protocols. Arion gestured for her to continue. "My people come from a world that is dying," Elena said, speaking carefully and using the translation technology that Thera had provided. "We traveled through space for more than 50 years to reach this planet. We did not come seeking to conquer or to dominate. We came seeking to survive. We came seeking a home where our children could have a future. Your world is vast. There is room for both our peoples if we choose to build peace instead of wage war." She paused and looked directly at the council members. "We have seen conflict between our 2 species end 3 times in history. Each time the conflict ended not because one species destroyed the other, but because both species chose to find common ground. Both species discovered that understanding was stronger than weapons. Both species learned that building together was more rewarding than fighting. This is what Thera has offered your people, a chance to become something greater than you have been." Rodriguez stepped forward to stand beside Elena. "I have commanded military forces for 30 years, he said. I have fought 17 hostile encounters with alien species. In every case, the species that survived were the ones that chose to understand their enemy before they chose to attack. The species that attacked without understanding are now extinct. Your people have a choice. You can follow the path that leads to extinction, or you can follow the path that Thera has shown you, the path toward building something greater. For a long time, no one spoke. The chamber was completely silent as the council members considered what they had heard. Some of them still looked angry. Others appeared thoughtful. A few seemed to be wavering in their certainty that destroying the humans was the only correct choice. Then Arian spoke again. "If we accept this proposal, what exactly would Thera have us do?" he asked. Thera walked to the center of the chamber and stood before the council with absolute confidence. "I propose that we establish a zone of mutual respect in the lower valleys. The humans will build their colonies there. We will maintain our control of the sky cities. We will establish trading relationships. We will share knowledge and technology. We will learn from each other. And over time, we will build an alliance that makes both our peoples stronger than we could ever be alone." "And what of your betrayal of the council's orders?" demanded Kestra, though her tone was no longer angry. "What punishment should you face?" Thera met Kestra's eyes directly. "That is for the council to decide. But I will tell you this. Every choice I made was made consciously and with full knowledge of the consequences. I knew that I would be called traitor. I knew that I would lose my rank and authority. I knew that my people might hunt me forever. I made those choices because I knew that they were right, and because I believed that my people were capable of wisdom even when it was difficult." Arian studied Thera for a long moment. Then he rose to his feet and incredibly he began to clap. The sound echoed through the chamber. One by one, other council members rose and joined him. Even Hector, who had called most loudly for her execution, eventually stood and added his voice to the acclamation. "It seems," Arian said when the applause had ended, "that your wisdom has overcome our fear. The council will vote on your proposal. All those in favor of establishing a zone of mutual respect and building alliance with the humans, instead of seeking their destruction, stand now." Every council member except one stood. Even the one who remained seated did not vote against. He simply abstained, maintaining his opposition but no longer fighting actively against the new direction. "The vote is clear," Arian declared. "We will pursue the path of peace and alliance. Thera, though you have technically committed treason, your actions have prevented a war that would have only brought suffering to both our peoples. Therefore, I propose that we recognize your treason as an act of wisdom so profound that it transcends the normal definitions of loyalty and betrayal." He paused and looked at all the council members. "Propose that Thera be appointed as our ambassador to the human people. Let her serve as the bridge between our worlds. Let her work to build the alliance that she has envisioned. All in favor?" Once again, all the council members but one stood in agreement. When the vote was finished, Thera found herself with a new title and a new responsibility. She was no longer simply a member of the council. She was now the voice of her entire people in dealings with the humans. Rodriguez walked over to her and extended his hand in the human gesture of peace. He was smiling broadly. "You have done what few leaders in history have ever managed," he said. "You have changed your people's entire approach to an existential question. You have done it not through force or manipulation, but through simple human wisdom. Well, elf wisdom, I suppose." Thera shook his hand firmly. "The hard work is just beginning," she replied, "but at least now both our peoples have the chance to choose peace. The rest will depend on how well we all work together to build something that honors both what your people have been and what my people can become." Midnight and Storm waited outside in the great courtyard. When Thera emerged from the council chambers, they saw the change in her immediately. The burden she had been carrying had shifted but not diminished. She had survived the judgment of her people. Now she would have to work to justify the decision that they had made. 5 years had passed since the day Thera had chosen betrayal over loyalty, and the world had transformed in ways that most of the older elves had thought impossible. The zone of mutual respect that had been established in the lower valleys had become a thriving center of cooperation and shared prosperity. Human colonies and elf settlements now existed side by side, their inhabitants learning each other's languages, trading goods, and building relationships that crossed the fundamental boundaries of species. Thera stood in the diplomatic center that had been constructed specifically for meetings between the elf and human leadership. The building was a beautiful blend of human and elf architecture. combining the clean geometric lines that humans favored with the flowing organic curves that elves preferred. It symbolized what both species had learned over the past 5 years. Different did not mean inferior. Different could mean complementary. Behind her, Midnight and Storm waited as they had waited for every important negotiation over the past 5 years. The dragons had become symbols of the alliance, visible proof that ancient enemies could stand together. Young elves and young humans would sometimes gather just to watch the dragons, fascinated by the visible connection between the two creatures and the woman who served as ambassador to both peoples. Rodriguez entered the center with his typical measured calm. He had become a governor of the human colonies, overseeing the expansion and development of human settlements across the lower valleys. His approach was always to build first and defend later, prioritizing the construction of communities over the construction of fortifications. "We have received the latest trade reports," he said, handing Thera a tablet filled with data. "The numbers are remarkable. Our agricultural exports to the Sky Cities have tripled. Your people are investing heavily in human technology companies. The exchange of knowledge is accelerating faster than even my optimistic projections suggested." Thera studied the data, feeling the satisfaction that came from seeing numbers that confirmed the reality she had worked toward for 5 years. The economic interdependence between the two peoples was becoming so complete that conflict was almost unthinkable. You could not easily wage war against people who provided you with essential resources and knowledge. "But we still face resistance from both sides," Rodriguez continued. "There are elves who believe that working with humans is beneath them. There are humans who fear that the elves will eventually dominate them through sheer longevity and power." Thera nodded. This was the constant challenge. Creating the structures that allowed peace was only half the battle. The other half was teaching millions of individuals to accept that their fears and prejudices were no longer serving them. "That is why I have been meeting with Kestra," Thera said. "She has been working with the younger elf warriors, showing them how to appreciate human courage and determination in ways that honor rather than threaten elf tradition. And Elena has been working with your military leaders to show them that elf intelligence and experience can enhance rather than threaten human capability." Elena appeared at that moment, walking through the doorway with her usual brisk efficiency. She was studying the human and elf populations to understand how they might live together more effectively. She was particularly fascinated by the ways that human adaptability and elf long-term thinking could complement each other. "I have been analyzing the educational programs that we have developed," Elena said. "The mixed schools where human and elf children learn together are producing remarkable results. Children who grow up together develop a natural instinct for cooperation that adults had to learn consciously. By the time these children reach adulthood, the idea of fighting between humans and elves will seem as strange to them as fighting between siblings." Rodriguez smiled. "That is perhaps the most important outcome of all. We are not just building peace for this generation. We are building a foundation for peace that will persist for generations to come." Arion arrived for the formal meeting of the Joint Council. He was now more than 800 years old, and the weight of centuries showed in his movements. But his mind remained sharp, and his commitment to the Alliance had only grown stronger over the past 5 years. "I have news from the Deep Council," Arion said, settling into his seat. "After much debate, they have approved the proposal for military cooperation. The elf warriors and human soldiers will begin joint training exercises. We will develop unified command structures. We will learn to fight together against external threats." This was significant. The elf leadership had been the last holdout against full integration. They worried that unified military forces might inevitably lead to elf commanders dominating human soldiers. But they had finally understood what Thera had been trying to teach them all along. Strength was not diminished by cooperation. Strength was multiplied by it. "There is also something else," Arion continued. "The Council has voted to recognize Thera formally as an equal member of the elf leadership structure. She will no longer serve simply as ambassador. She will have full voice and vote in all Council decisions affecting both peoples." This announcement created a moment of stunned silence. Thera had been stripped of her Council rank 5 years ago because of her treason. Now she was being not just restored to Council membership, but elevated to a position of even greater authority than she had held before. "Thank you," Thera said to Arion, "but I want to serve in this role only if it is understood that I represent both our peoples equally. I will never again be only a representative of the elves. I will always speak for humans as well, because I have learned that what serves both people serves us all. Arion nodded slowly. This is exactly what we hoped you would say. The council has decided this knowing that you would interpret your role in this way. We need someone who understands that loyalty to one's own people sometimes means having the courage to stand against them when they are wrong. The formal meetings continued for hours, discussing trade agreements, cultural exchange programs, security protocols, and the 1,000 other details that went into maintaining peace between two species. By the time the meeting ended, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Thera walked back to the ancient settlements with Rodriguez beside her. They had become close friends over the past 5 years, bonded by the shared experience of working towards something that most people had thought was impossible. Do you ever regret it? Rodriguez asked. The choice you made 5 years ago. Do you ever wonder what your life would have been if you had simply accepted the council's decision and allowed them to attack? Thera considered the question carefully before answering. Regret implies that there was a choice between two equally viable options. There was not. There was only the choice between what was right and what was easy. I chose what was right. That has never been something that I regret. They arrived at the ancient dragon roosts where Midnight and Storm waited. The dragons were aging now, visible in the way they moved and in the slight dimming of their scales. But they were still powerful, still magnificent, still the living symbols of what was possible when different species chose to work together. Thera climbed onto Midnight's back for the last time that day, feeling the familiar comfort of the dragon's scaled surface beneath her. Storm moved close beside them, and Rodriguez reached out to stroke the older dragon's snout in a gesture of affection that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. You have accomplished something remarkable, Rodriguez said. You showed a species on the brink of destroying each other that there was another option. You showed them that strength is not always found in weapons. You showed them that wisdom is sometimes more powerful than pride. Thera looked at her old friend and smiled. I did nothing alone, she replied. You showed your people that accepting help from a different species did not make them weak. Kestra showed elf warriors that courage could take many forms. Elena showed both peoples that understanding was possible, even when the differences seemed insurmountable. I simply made a choice and others chose to follow that choice toward something better. Midnight and Storm launched themselves into the air, catching the wind that flowed through the valleys. Below them, human settlements and elf towers glowed with the last light of day. Above them, the twin moons were beginning to rise in the darkening sky. 5 years of peace between two species had seemed impossible. Now it was beginning to seem inevitable, and as Thera flew between the worlds she had brought together, she understood that the hardest part was not creating the alliance. The hardest part was maintaining it year after year, negotiation after negotiation, decision after decision, always choosing the path that honored both peoples. But that was also the most rewarding part, because every day that passed without war was a day that millions of humans and elves got to build their lives in safety. Every day was proof that different species could not just coexist but could thrive together. Midnight and Storm flew through the twilight, carrying their rider between the worlds she had united. And somewhere in the human settlements below, children of both species played together without fear. Somewhere in the elf cities above, elders were teaching the young about a woman who had had the courage to betray her own people in service to a greater loyalty, a loyalty to wisdom itself.